Hey, it's Andy Meadows, the host of Radio Influencers. Little disclaimer here at the top. As we were recording this episode, we had a connection issue. And as we scrambled to fix that, we created a different audio issue on our end that we did our best to clean up in post. But it's not too bad, but I know a lot of radio people watch this and listen to it, so it will annoy you a little bit. But I encourage you to power through it because our guest, Mike Castellucci from Longboard Insights, has some really powerful advice for radio programmers on what data to consider when they're trying to decide what music to add, music to drop, to move, to rest on their radio stations. So please stay tuned. Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. And I've got a very special guy on the phone with me. I've been wanting to get into this topic for quite some time because I have a lot of conversations about this. Mike Castellucci from Longboard Insights. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Andy. How are you?
I'm doing good. Sorry, I started talking about you and I didn't even give you a chance to say hi.
Everything was factual, so I have nothing to disagree with there.
Yeah, but you are a radio influencer, and so that's kind of why I wanted to have you on here because now, granted, your background was more in the record industry, but you also spent quite a bit of time working directly with radio programmers. I know your background. Can you tell them a little bit about what you've done?
Absolutely. I started out really as a musician first. I was a music performance and management major over at William Patterson University. Through my degree, I found myself at an internship with Warner Music Group, and that's where I really got the label bug. And they plopped me into radio promotion. So where I knew nothing about the insides of radio before, I learned plenty of it in my internship, and that's where my career started, becoming a promotion assistant for Electro Roadrunner, and then moving my way over to a promotion manager in the Southeast for Atlantic Records. And then I was promoted with Atlantic to the West Coast territory. And since then, I now have my own product, which aligns with this radio world that I've come to know so well through the help of plenty of program directors that I've spoken to over the years.
And before we get too far into that, what was your instrument?
My principal instrument was trumpet.
Oh, okay. So I'm a singer. I'm a bad guitar player. I'm an even worse piano player. But I have a 10-piece big band I play with a couple times a year. I sing with a couple times a year. So I have a trumpet player that's pretty dang good.
Big band music's fun, man. It's big, it's loud, it's got everything. I love listening to that stuff.
Yeah, I always say it's a really smart thing to play music from 60 to 80 years ago, which is about the average of everything that I do. So
Are they going to be saying that in like 100 years, or is it going to be like, oh, you know what, that music from 160 years ago is really where it's at?
who knows, man? Who knows?
Yeah.
Oh, so what's the easiest way to explain the power indicator score to like a new pretend like you're explaining it to a brand new programmer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the quickest way to do it is it's a system it's an algorithm that's used that utilizes stats instead of surveys to give essentially an apples to apples comparison of any record that a programmer might be considering to add or might be considering a rotation move.
So
It's
is this kind of like or exactly like the information that a record label would look at to determine is that artist catching fire or not?
So it's exactly the same as hard to use, right? I think record labels are looking at plenty of different metrics. Relationships are certainly a part of that as well. But the tagline that I need to credit Sean Ross with this, he's the one who gave me the idea. But it's more than streams and it's faster than call out. So for anyone who's in programming, we all know that call out has been the kind of conventional metric to use to evaluate songs.
Sure.
Unfortunately, it's never been able to evaluate ads because it's strictly based on familiar records. Where the power indicator score is helpful is every song, whether you're playing it or not on the chart, has a score, so you can make a bit more of a well-informed decision regardless of the familiarity on your station.
And call out doesn't work as well on every format, don't you think?
Well, it's less used, right? So if you look at the alternative format, there are significantly less stations utilizing it. With iHeart, obviously, they have consolidated call out, and with 180 stations on the pop panel, roughly right now, I think iHeart has I think at least half of them. So that's a lot of stations to have call out, and since it's all within the company, they have some pretty sharp numbers. But yeah, I mean, depending on the format, Active Rock, it's also an expensive service. So unless you have the budget to afford something like that, you're not even going to have that evaluating tool in your box.
Well, and that's why I asked that about record labels, because what I've heard from a lot of, especially radio people at independently owned groups, smaller markets, is well, I would love to look at that stuff, but it's incredibly expensive. Labels can afford that. We can't afford that.
Right. Well, and then it's all about thinking about the process, right? Kind of tracing the money. For the labels, their money is coming from successful artists. So they need to have technology and metrics and information on all of these artists. That's their cash cow. But when we're looking at a radio station, the music is important to keep ears tuned in. But in reality, it's all about the advertisers, right? And if you have the ratings and if you have the TSL to convince an advertiser that the most people are going to listen to their commercial on your station, it's great. But there's a lot of different tools that I think you need to be able to kind of find that evaluator. So when you're now picking between what am I going to use to convince advertisers to work with me and pay me, and then what am I going to use to evaluate music, it's kind of hard to have equal spends on both of those problems.
Right. And I know this is a tricky question because you don't want to give away the secret sauce, but what platforms do you pull data from?
Well, look, the great thing about the sauce that I can tell you right off the bat is it is gluten-free, it is vegan-free, it is sugar-free. Outside of that, what it also contains... That's good,
because according to my doctor, I have to eat gluten-free because my doctor's a jerk.
I mean, look, that's the gluten-free thing. Like, I get it. You know, you have celiac disease. Obviously, we don't want to be talking about this stuff, right? Privacy information with medical stuff. But I mean, look, sorry, I tried to make that into a joke and it didn't work. I'm just going to call that out right now. So I guess we can clip that. Yeah. So essentially what makes up this number, and what I've tried to do, is take multiple metrics and combine them into one number. By doing that, it saves you the time of having to look through a bunch of different charts, and it's taking into account all of these metrics. So all stream providers are accounted for. On-demand audio streams are provided into the algorithm. It also includes chart history. So when we're looking at Mediabase and seeing how an artist or a song has done at a current format, at crossing formats, that's all in there as well. And then kind of the proprietary ingredient I'll throw in there as well is the familiarity factor. Okay. What I wanted to do with
this... basically what they would have been getting from call out, but it takes a lot longer. Kind of.
Yeah. So it's to kind of simulate. With call out, it's a survey, right? So you're reaching out to your listeners and you're asking them, do you like the song? Do you not like the song? Do you know the song? Do you not know the song? Understanding how important that is to evaluating a record's success on a station, I've tried to simulate that. And the way I'm able to do it is, you know, we could talk about two different records. Let's say right now, Taylor Swift Fortnite is a great example of a familiar record, and we know why that is, compared to an artist that perhaps hasn't been all over the radio stations or the TV stations.
Yeah.
Exactly. And given that, we can kind of make some predictions as to how familiar a record's going to be. And over the time of running the power indicator score, we found a lot of parallels. And the nice thing about the power indicator score is, on average, it's able to anticipate call-out results by an average of 5 weeks.
In your opinion, can radio make a song familiar on its own anymore?
It can make it familiar to their listeners, and it does. So the way that I kind of envision that for radio now is, if we look at the onion, as Shrek likes to call it, right? Onions have layers. Yeah. So the smallest layer is that core. that's going to be, an artist's biggest fans, right? They're the biggest fans, but it's the smallest group of people. They know more about the artist sometimes than the artist knows about themselves. But there's not that many of those folks. So as you move away from the core, the number of audience members that you find in any layer is going to be bigger, but they're also going to be less engaged than that smaller layer before them. I think radio is the outer layer of the onion. It's the largest amount of people, but it's also, in many cases, people who may be the most unfamiliar with someone until their art makes it to the radio. So that's where I think you can have a big budding star or a big streaming record that is absolutely familiar with their biggest fans and perhaps medium level fans. But if there are folks who are just listening to radio, they may not know about these folks. And I do think that radio is absolutely breaking, these kind of streaming artists to their mainstream fans. And, they're not that different from a mainstream pop listener that's using a streaming service.
Right. And so I'm glad you said that, because I kind of feel like radio's role is, which is somewhat similar to what you said in there, to take a song from here to there.
Yeah.
It's very hard to, I don't feel like radio now, with the competition and the way everybody gets their music, can take a song from 0 to 100 on its own, or to use numbers like what's your highest on the power indicator score?
So the scoring range, I guess, would be important to bring up. The lowest score is a 1, the highest score is an 11.
Okay.
So
radio couldn't take a song to 11 without some help, more than likely, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, radio just doesn't do that. So if you look at streaming numbers and you look at airplay numbers, just those two things in a vacuum, there isn't a causation that kind of lines the two up, right? You don't see records going to radio, and because of being on radio, they start to stream. It happens sometimes. You kind of see some similarities. Obviously, if a song gets released, and there's a new release from a core artist, it's hitting streaming services and it's hitting radio at the same time. So, of course, it'll be an event record and it's also going to stream very well. But that's not because radio did that or streaming affected radio. They just kind of went at the same time. And then when we look at, second singles, a lot of times, if radio starts playing it, we don't necessarily see this rise in streams the way we saw it with sales in the past.
Right. But that's kind of the point of why it's so important for radio to look at this data, and why it's such an early indicator that, this is something you should be on.
Right. And for the same reasons that we just talked about, right? When you're the biggest layer, you're the last layer. So what can radio do to pick better hits? It's look to the hits, right? Look at the progress of these records, which is also what record labels are doing. So, when you are discussing how labels even evaluate talent, one of the things they're looking for is, okay, if you're in front of a wider audience, is this wider audience embracing what you're putting out there, right? If someone is performing on a very big stage and there's only 5 people in front of the stage, it's probably not going well. But if you're on the main stage of insert X festival here and you have thousands of people watching you, you're probably doing okay.
Right. But it does, part of it's also redefining what a hit is, which I think the record industry's done, but I don't think radio's done. But the way you kind of worded it there is a perfect way to word it. It's basically, if it's not connecting with the audience, it doesn't matter that the audience has been exposed to it. It's not a hit.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that we always need to listen to as curators, is understanding that, there's one individual, sometimes a group of individuals, who are making, programming decisions, and having gut is an important thing. But if you don't think of the audience, it's not going to connect. Yeah.
Well, and the best way, this is the pushback I get, because I'm a guy who developed the gut because I've been programming forever. And right. I was real proud of my gut and my ability to pretty accurately guess whether a song was going to connect or not. But I was still wrong, 10% of the time at least, which adds up to a lot of records over
Yeah.
the years that I missed on, or
Hmm.
one way or the other, played and I shouldn't have, or the other way around. But in my opinion, the way we could still use that gut is to help us figure out what format the song goes on, or if we're programming multiple stations, or whether it fits on our individual station and our individual market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's where gut, I think, really comes into play. You know, when you're a master of your market and you've been in your market, or you're familiar with your brand, that is when you should be considering it. And you know, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, everyone's toolbox for evaluating music was much smaller, right? You didn't have stream numbers, you didn't have TikTok, you didn't have Shazam, you didn't have all these different metrics to look at for a song, right? You had the gut, you had whatever your record rep said, you had sales numbers. And when you have that kind of smaller toolbox, you know, you can still get the job done. You may need to do a little bit of jerry rigging and MacGyvering to get something fixed, but you can do a lot with a single roll of duct tape. But what you can do with an entire toolbox, with a Phillips head, a flathead, an adjustable wrench, once that toolbox starts to build and you have more metrics, using your gut will help you with the repair that you've done 10 times, but having a more expanded toolbox is going to get the job done easier, and it's going to be better quality fix.
Well, imagine if you took a programmer from 1995, got them in a time machine, and put them into right now. They would be so overjoyed at all the tools that are available to them. And so that's what drives me crazy when you're talking to programmers and they're reluctant to look at this stuff. It's like, dude, all of this is under your fingertips right now. You know what I mean?
Well, we're creatures of habit, right? So if you
Right.
take that programmer from 1995 who was killing it in the ratings, and then they say, okay, you're giving me more metrics, but you're telling me that, my share has gone from, a 50
Yeah,
to
that's
now
true.
I'm
That's right.
fighting I'm fighting in the trenches for a 6 and I have all these numbers. They must not work, right? And I think we're creatures of habit. So if something has worked for us in the past, we're going to continue to do that until we are in an environment where we're forced to change. And then you have to believe in the process that it works, because through learning, you're not necessarily going to jump up to the top of the ratings either. And I think, both of us kind of coming from that consulting perspective, that's a hard thing to convince, right? Especially to someone who's a rating leader. How do you get them to look forward? They don't want to do anything that's going to lose them a share, which inevitably can happen any book period.
Yeah. So let's talk about that process. How
Okay.
often is this data updated?
This data is updated weekly. So another pain point, I mean, a lot of this was spurned from conversations I had as a regional rep. I dealt with over 100 radio stations across the country in the Southeast and on the West Coast. And call out was a new thing to me. I didn't really know how it worked. And through slowly learning, I was able to develop, okay, what are the pain points that, my programmers across the country are dealing with this service? It's extremely expensive. Generally, it's a rolling 2 weeks, if that. And those were things that I wanted to model against. My thought was, is there a service that I could create that gives us fresh weekly information? Is there something less volatile, right? When a song is unfamiliar for 4 weeks and then its first read, it comes back as, weak research, but then a week later it comes back as strong. How can we does that mean that it's really a mid-pack record, or does that mean we still need to get it more familiar? And conversely, a record that calls out early and then wanes its way down, what happened there? So that's another part of the algorithm, is I like to make sure that it's not too sensitive. A lot of times we'll see records increase, but for the most part, you're never going to see a record that goes from a 3 to a 9. I mean, in the last 2 years that I've run this program, that's never happened.
So anybody listening that thinks, well, I could probably compile a lot of this on my own and figure out the services and yada, yada, yada. How long would that take somebody to do?
I think it depends, right? Because one of the great things about programming, when folks really empower their programmers, is to use their process. And everyone has a different process.
Yeah.
So some people perhaps use a little bit more of their gut, which is a bit faster. Other people are very strict to call out, which you have to wait for call out. And then I had other programmers that I would talk to who, took a Shazam chart from label X and were provided sales numbers by someone else. And by having all of these partners, provide data to them, it's a great thing to have. But you're also kind of handcuffed to whoever is sending you the last report. And whenever that comes in, now you have to kind of consolidate it all into a spreadsheet if that's what you do. But when I've talked to the clients who are using the power indicator score, I have some that use it as an accessory to some of their local research just to balance things out. Others use it solely. And there are folks who kind of used to collect information from a bunch of other people, and they're saying that this is saving them at least an hour in their music meeting. So you tally that up over every week. Now you got 2 days to be able to put towards, all the other things that a programmer has to do outside of music.
Well, and we have an internal here at my consulting company. We have an internal process that takes us way longer than I would like.
Yeah.
To track. And to be honest, the only ones we're watching, just because of manpower, we're watching YouTube and Spotify, and that's it, because that's all we have the time to look at. We feel like it helps us have some insight, but I can tell you this week when we were looking at songs on Monday, what the first thing we looked at was your email.
Oh yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you so much.
Well, because we do a lot of Hot AC and Top 40 stuff, and obviously that's the one where, to me, the data tells you the most, the quickest. And so it was a good way to save us time and point us in the right direction before we even started going down the road.
Well, so here we go. As a real life testimonial, this was the first time for all the listeners or anyone. This is the first time that you've looked at this email that I sent out, right?
Yep.
So what Andy is talking about with the power indicator score, and I'm sure we're going to get into this later, there's a weekly report updated Sunday nights. And what I do with that report is I also send out a weekly rundown email that really points to the highlighted records, the stuff that I think people should be focusing on. And that is also included in your subscription with the weekly report. So based on your first look there, I am kind of curious, how did it change your process? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? How did it help you?
Well, one thing it helped on, the thing I'm always nervous about, one thing I'm bad about is being comfortable delegating. I have to get better at that. Because not that I'm a control freak. I'm not saying that by any means, but
I'm the same way. I understand where you're coming from.
So I'm always nervous because I did lose a client once because we had missed on a country song, and country is my wheelhouse, and so it ate at me, and so I'm always like nervous. Is there a song or two that's secretly blowing up that I'm not catching because I'm not looking at enough of the data? So it helped with that. There was one song, I wish I could tell you off the top of my head. There was one song that we weren't yet watching that we saw your number, and then we went and looked at it, and we're like, dang it, why weren't we watching this tune yet?
Awesome. Well, look, I hope you found it helpful. And the other thing, like you're saying, is to be able to catch a record when it's popular. Yeah. I think the old kind of structure of radio, when you're the only gatekeeper, you're responsible for not just that last layer of the onion, but you're responsible for the other 2 layers before that. Right. So, decades ago, radio was the one getting it familiar with their listeners and the rest of the country. Now, being able to kind of release that burden of, you don't need to play this record for 10 weeks. Sometimes popular records now can be, just a moment in time. I think records are all built differently. They don't all need to stand the test of time. One of the things that I remember programmers telling me when I asked them about their methodology and how they would add records, it was a very popular response to hear from people that the records they add, they're hoping turn into their future powers, turn into their golds. I think every programmer would love to do that. But If you look at the numbers and how many records a programmer is going to add in a given year and how many golds you can physically tally in a year, they're not all going to get there. So if we reframe that question, I think the reason folks want powers and golds is because they know those are the songs that's going to keep an ear tuned in and win that quarter hour, right? So is there a way to do that without perhaps committing on a song where you're just going to have to find out if you play it. And using the power indicator score, we can take the records that are hot now, specifically with the pop audience, put them on the airwaves. And once we start to see those numbers come down, those records can come off. And there's another set of records with good scores to be able to fill it in. So the days of putting on a record before the numbers are there, holding on to it for 5 weeks and saying, oh, thank God it's a hit.
Yeah.
You don't have to flip the coin like that anymore. Now you have enough records to pull from. And the other thing, too, is with streaming providers, there's over 100,000 songs released to DSPs every day. So something's going to come out. I think the big lament is, oh, there's no real hits anymore. But the reality is they are there. It's just a little harder to find because the haystack's a little bigger. And I think the other part of that, too, is, and we talked about this a little earlier, was defining a hit. I think the term hit is a bit subjective right now, and we need to work on finding an objective agreement on what a hit really is and how they perform. I think once you do that and you have this universal language of what it is, we're going to see that, hey, it's the biggest records. And we still have that.
And you said something when we talked on the phone a week or two ago that really hit home. And I think it's a pretty good way to define it. Basically, a hit nowadays is one that's working on all the platforms.
A hit hits on every metric.
Yeah. I think, that's how you put it. And that's a great way that's a great way to define it, I think. And so there's really no difference between, there's not a streaming hit and a radio hit. There's just a hit because it works on, you've got to be able to work on multiple platforms for it to actually blow up to the level of the big guys now.
That's exactly how I see it. I think a hit is universal if there's a song that's, a turntable hit, which I personally don't believe is a thing anymore. That just means all a turntable hit implies to me is that radio got behind an artist and collectively decided we're going to all spin this record a bunch, right? That, obviously it's going to take into account the people who have research, they confided in that, but it's not to say that you can't have everyone decide, hey, this is the record we're going to go for. And when you only have 25 songs on a playlist, that group thing can kind of pop in easily if you have a lot of chart watchers. The other side of it, though, is the same thing can happen with stream providers. If a streaming partner is working with an artist and they think, hey, this is going to be the big one, before a song is released, no one knows, right? And we've seen big artists do big releases and big partnerships with different DSPs, and it doesn't always lead to big streams, right? And I think that's the same thing where if you have a ton of placement on a streaming service and it doesn't lead to streams, that's kind of your answer that perhaps it wasn't a hit.
Force a hit. Yeah, and you really never could anyway, but especially but it's just more evident in the data now. I think it's always really been that way, but you brought up a good point. I mean, you'll see somebody come from another industry that's a huge movie star put out a song and they've clearly got tons of money behind it, but it doesn't become a hit because it just doesn't connect with the audience. So it'll look good for like a day or two because they've got too much money behind it. But if you watch the data for even it won't even take a week to tell you that that's not connected.
Well, and then familiarity too, right? When you're talking about YouTube, I think one of the pitfalls of YouTube, of TikTok, of any visual component or visual platform, you can put a sound behind it, and TikTok's really interesting because now Pillboard publishes the top sounds on TikTok, which is just the songs that are most used, along with videos from user uploads.
Yeah.
What you'll see is any given week, if you look in the top 10 even of that chart, some of those records are streaming very well, and to me, those are the records that are truly hitting on multiple metrics where people are using the song in their visual, but they're also listening to it on a streaming service. Other songs could be perhaps attached to a dance challenge or could be kind of something out of meme culture where the song bears significance, but it's also attached to a visual. And those songs mean something to folks, But from an auditory sense on radio, if you don't have that visual and that song isn't streaming, it shows you that perhaps the reason that's a part of the Zeitgeist isn't because of the song alone, and perhaps isn't an appropriate place to be on radio.
Well, and you said something earlier that I wanted to follow up on, because I see the two things I see a lot in the reluctance to kind of change the habits of how they decide what to add, what to drop, what to move to different categories is one, the person that really misses being the guy or gal that makes the final decision, and it's in that gatekeeper that controls it, which there's an upside and a downside to that, because there's no longer, no matter how big a station you work for, how many stations you're on, that one person's opinion cannot make a song blow up anymore. It just doesn't work that way. Hadn't worked that way in a while. And the second thing is, on the chart watchers, I still see a lot that just want to watch media based to see what other stations add and add it. Why? Can you kind of back me up here? Why is that a bad strategy?
Well, look, I think the strategy comes from an old model that we talked about. When you have less tools in the toolbox, that's a way to fix the leak, but that leak is going to spring up again. But the interesting thing about most added records, I actually just went back and polled the most added record at Top 40 since July of 22 till just up until now. Technically, I have it as February 21st because we have a lot of records since then that are most added, but we don't know where their peaks are yet, right? A lot of the records are still kind of running. So I wanted to just work with songs that have kind of found their peak to really kind of look in the rubble and see what the results were. And out of 79 ad weeks, when we look at the most added record at Top 40, 25% of those records ended up going number one. So 1 in 4 chance that if you were most added, you would end up number one at Top 40. And then 43%, so just under half of those records, didn't even go top 10.
Yeah.
So it kind of goes to show you that there is some variety, right? Like it can certainly pick some of the records that are real hits. People are getting on and going for it, but being most added isn't, ensuring necessarily the success of a record. And then when we looked at I looked at the power indicator score to kind of compare that. So I took the average power indicator score week over week for all of these songs. I took their lowest rank, and then I took their rank at the time of adding. And what I noticed when I was looking at the average power indicator score of all of those 79 records was, when we break out the numbers, again, 11 is the best you can do, 1 is the worst you can do. 7.5 has become a really interesting number just in the history of the power indicator score. If you are scoring a 7.5 week over week, you're twice as likely to go top 10 compared to the other records that hit the chart.
Oh, interesting.
So whenever anyone is looking at the power indicator score chart, I always highlight records that are scoring at least a 7.5 and above. What I noticed with these 7.5 and above records from the most added, 56% of the records that scored an average power indicator score, so week over week for their entire life, they were a 7.5 and above. Over half of those records went to number one, compared to a quarter of just most added records. And then the thing that was even more interesting is when we look at the most added media-based record, 43% of those records ended up outside of the top 10. If you were most added and the average power indicator score you had was a 7.5, only 8% of those records landed outside of 10. And I think that was only like 1 or 2.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the challenge. So in my previous company and as a consultant, one of the things that I've specialized and been used a lot for is coming in to clean up a database that's gotten out of hand. You know what I mean? So, So one of the mistakes. So maybe I'm a little jaded because I've seen this mistake a lot. But the people who are unwilling to admit they added a song that they shouldn't, and they let that live in their database in perpetuity, and then the database just goes gets just
Hmm.
insanely big, and you look at it, and there's so many songs in there that should not have been added in the first place, and definitely shouldn't be have have been played for years and years. So you have to be willing to admit, I mean, you have to be just as willing to drop a song as you are to add a song, in my opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you need to stay up on a song, right? Constant temperature checks is an important thing. Now, that's very time consuming. It can be very expensive, but that's also why I run the numbers every week, because sometimes you have an event week and something's really hot, and for the most part, these scores will stay where they are. But once scores start to fall, that's when people want to take note, right? And if you start to see a score fall, there's times where you can determine, hey, now is the time, the sun is setting, let me put something else in. And then conversely, when we're looking at the start of a record, sometimes you have two slots open and you have three records or four records that you're looking into. If you were to compare all those records with something like the power indicator score, you know that all these records are being compared the same way through the same algorithm. And those four scores could be a 7.5, an 8.3, a 3.5, and a 2. And that decision of which two are going to stay and which two are going to go becomes much easier, right? You can just
Yeah.
take those top two scoring ones, and then it takes, a little bit of the gut away. And it also takes, I think, where the gut kind of hurts people is when it comes to core artists, where
Yes.
the old model was, the more familiar artist is going to be more helpful. Now we kind of have the understanding of having a familiar artist is helpful if the song is good, but if people aren't interacting with the song, then perhaps that's not the right one. And perhaps a record coming from someone that folks aren't as familiar with should be in that place instead if it's streaming very well. A great example is there's this artist, Tommy Richmond, who has a song called Million Dollar
Yeah, Million
Baby.
Dollar Baby. Yep.
And I think if you were to kind of put a picture of Tommy Richmond in front of most pop listeners, they wouldn't be able to identify him, but they would be able to identify that song. I mean, the numbers that song is doing right now are incredible. And right now, there are a few core artists on the chart right now, and they have plenty of hits at the format, but their current song right now just isn't measuring up. And I think in those cases where a programmer's instinct may be, oh, X artist is familiar, this won't hurt me. I do think if that artist's weaker song is keeping the new hot song off, I think it does kind of hurt you.
Well, and a couple of things I'll tag on there is that the theory that this artist has put out so many previous hits, this one's got to be a hit. It's a safe one to play. Gets us in a lot of trouble in lots of formats, pretty much in every format. So you got to be careful for that. But I have a lot of, as a musician, I got a lot, on the side. It's more of a hobby. It's not what I do for a living, but I
You don't need to be modest about
I
it.
I have a lot of musician buddies that know I'm a radio guy, so they always say, this this song is so much better than this other song that's playing on, and it's like that's not what it's about. I mean, I wish it was. As a musician, I wish the best written song, the best produced song, would always be a number one hit, but that's just not how it works. It's just at that time, does it connect with the audience or not? Because you may see a song that uh, a really good song that's just not, it came out at the wrong time, you know.
Oh, we see that all the time, right? I mean, there are records that become mainstream hits one year, but were created, mastered, recorded, 5, 10, 15. In the case of Running Up That Hill,
Cape,
over 20 years ago.
perfect
Yeah.
example. What didn't
Um,
go anywhere in 1984, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of songs and a lot of artists can be before their time. And, I do want to point out, I called a song good before, and I want to mark that as something that we shouldn't do, right? Because
Yeah.
when it comes to art, it is so subjective in the individual sense. But when we're playing the game of figuring out what's going to be a mainstream hit, we can't look at it that way, right? Because individual opinions aren't going to matter unless you have a large collective agreement. which is also where I think sometimes, call out can be difficult because you're dealing with such a small sample size. And where I wanted to create something that would be a little bit more equitable to the top 40 listener, regardless of your demographics, is looking at all pop listeners. When the advertisers are looking for folks to spend money, do they really care? I mean, I know they're targeting certain genders and they're targeting certain ages, but what we should really be thinking is who's listening to the pop music? And if that's a younger or an older person, or they're across gender or racial demographics, we should respect that. They're a pop listener, and advertisers who are advertising on a pop station want those people in their doors.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, the one of the early things that, a, I have a tough time feel like ever saying a song sucks or an artist sucks because uh, they had the guts to put it out there, and that takes a lot of it. It takes a lot of guts to get up on stage, and to perform
Yeah,
in front of people. So I never like jump on the bandwagon of this artist stinks or sucks or any of that. But one of the things early on when you start programming, you got to quickly get over is you're going to add a lot of songs that you don't like, that you don't personally think, or even if you're right in the wheelhouse of the demo, age wise, and you're into that kind of that format of music, you're still going to add a ton of songs that you personally cannot stand. It's just how it is.
absolutely. Well, that's what popularity is, right? If 10, it's majority rules. If 10 people really like something, if 10 people really like a new flavor of ice cream and you can't stand it, you're the 11th person who doesn't like it, but you really like this one flavor that no one else likes. I mean, who's going to win, right? If your goal is to sell units, if your goal is to put the most mass appeal product or song or art out there, you kind of have to follow the economics, right?
Yeah.
And it does take, I think, as someone else who comes from the music world, yeah, there's plenty of songs that I absolutely love, but I'm also realistic in the fact that they're never going to be mainstream hits because it's a little bit small for that, and sometimes for the scope of popularity, you need to be wide, you need to be accessible. And some of those records I love. Others, perhaps aren't on my personal playlists,
Yeah.
but that's the beauty of it.
Right. And I'm such a weirdo. It's kind of easy for me to set my taste aside because they're so odd. But when a programmer really loves the format of music that they're programming in, they've got to be careful of that because it's real easy to just assume that I like this music, so everything I like is probably going to be safe to add. And it's like, no, it's you're gonna eventually you're gonna age out of your demo, you know, to begin with. But you just
I think many folks already are, right? I mean, if you look at the amount of perhaps older males who are programming pop stations, you could say they've been out of demo for quite a long time.
yeah.
But that's the thing. Should it apply? I think discipline is important in understanding who you are versus who you serve.
Right.
So understanding that being in the pop world, being in the industry, you absolutely have knowledge that you can bring to your decisions, but you can't disregard the people that you serve, right? And it's easy for us to overthink our decisions or come at it from a different angle because for us it's our jobs, right? If you don't do a good job, you're going to lose it.
Sure.
But that same pressure isn't brought to a listener, right? If the listener listens to the wrong station and ends up switching, they're not going to lose their job over it. For them it is entertainment. And the other thing that's always difficult is from the programming lens, your goal is how can I get the listener to listen to commercials on my station? But no one in their right mind is going into their car and saying, I wonder what station I'm going to listen to my commercials on today.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's so true, and that's where some of the programming tricks uh, can backfire too. What we haven't talked about the cost, but what is it? What does Power Indicator Score cost to get, and how can stations get it?
So one of the things that I wanted to do was I want this to be an equitable service that anyone can use. There's plenty of non-reporters that as a major label employee, I wasn't able to really work with because so much of my time was spent with the reporters.
Yeah.
But they're trying to accomplish the same thing. And I want to be able to provide a service that can help those folks as well as reporters The way it works is there's a 30-day free trial. So anyone can go to my website, longboardinsights.com, and they can click into the power indicator score. I have a pitch deck that goes into a little bit more detail. I'm always accessible as well. And the way it works is you just register right on the website. It's a 30-day free trial. After the 30 days, the service is just $25 a month. And what that service includes is a fresh power indicator report every week. And it also includes the weekly rundown email. So you can kind of get centered on, perhaps what are the records to look at.
Do you have any plans on adding other formats?
Right now, I just got the report up on my website. So we're kind of just in new days as far as pop goes. So what I would like to do is grow it at pop first. I know this service works. I've been running it for 2 years, but now have it in a place where I think people can really kind of get onto it easily. And what I would like to do is grow that. And once I kind of see what I need to as far as momentum goes, then scale it out to country is on the list. And alternative is something else that people have been asking for.
Yeah, well,
so
it would work.
Those could be on the deep horizon.
It would also work well on urban.
Yeah,
because those songs you can tell really quickly whether they're catching or not, and they're kind of leading the way on. I mean, you're a label guy, so I mean, it seems like the way it's going to be done going forward is kind of put it all out at once and see what gets traction. Don't you think?
You know what? I think one of the things with labels is we're going to see more of it's not one size fits all.
Right.
So much of having a successful artist development story is understanding who that artist is and I think how their listeners work. Because some artists are really good at putting out a ton of releases. Others are a little bit more kind of old fashioned in the sense of it's very structured. Excuse me. And you can I think the album cycle is kind of going away at this point, but it also depends on who the artist.
Yeah, and depending on the genre and the artist, right?
Yeah, look, I'm an album guy, and I love vinyl as well. But I think on the whole, if you are an artist, scale is important. The more songs that you have available to stream, they're looking at TSL too, right? The longer people can stream from you, the more money you're going to make off of streaming. Perhaps the more ad revenue you're going to get if you also are able to transpose that to video content on a platform like YouTube. But just the way that it used to be released, as in like, okay, we're going to just land this all at one. A lot of times it's kind of hard to pick the second hit, right? Because everyone's consuming it right now. And which of those songs will hold over time? I think that's where you can kind of stretch releases more in like a singles based releasing model.
Yeah.
But it also comes down to the artist, right? Some artists can write more than others, and others need time to kind of sit down and work it all through. So if you can put out multiple songs, I think for individual artists, that's a great thing to see. But then you also need to kind of manage the line of how much is too much. Because sometimes if you put too much out there, then you have songs that are sitting up on the shelf, which, with the way that Spotify has renegotiated their stream payouts, if you have a song that isn't generating any streams, you're going to lose money on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one good thing, like sometimes when an artist is working with a label and then they get to the point where they don't have to have a label, like they're so big they own their own label or something, the music gets a little weaker because it turns out they shouldn't have put out all 20 songs. You know what I mean? So it turns out there was a reason to cut 10 of those off the album or a couple, you know what I'm saying? So
I think it depends, right? Because
it can be work against you.
Yeah, it's tough, and so much of it I think comes down to the artist also understanding their audience. If something is working, it's the same as programmers. Listen to your audience.
Yeah.
When you don't do that is typically when people run into problems.
What's the main thing in your opinion, if you had to pick one thing that labels look at to really determine this artist is getting traction?
So I think the biggest thing, and it's going to depend on who you ask, right? But I think in my opinion, and the opinion of most, is you want to look at an audience to consumption ratio, right? If you have an artist who has a lot of followers, or if they're on the radio, or if they're being very well covered by streaming providers, and it's not generating interaction with the consumer, that's something to be mindful of. But if someone has less followers and they're generating more activity, then that's something that people want to see. And if you're going to be putting advances into artists and hoping to recoup those expenses and create superstars, that's where you see the interest, right? Because if your diehard fans are, small but mighty, that's going to scale to, I think, mainstream popularity, where, someone's message is so clear and it's so tangible that it's easy to pass on. And, I think there's a lot of folks out there who are able to write, and there's someone out in the corner of the world who says, this person is speaking my language right now. And that's kind of how you can see it early.
Well, that's good to hear, though, because I feel like people sometimes get so caught up in the big number, like X amount of social followers, X amount of total stream.
Yeah, they call them vanity metrics, right?
Yeah.
So that's the running term of, okay, like, how many followers do you have? I mean, what does that really mean?
How many
now,
are actively listening every month? How many are engaging on your content? How many, that's the stuff that really tells you, right?
Yeah, and a lot of this is just so old model. I remember before I got into the industry, I was, I think, in between years in college, and I was waiting tables at an Outback Steakhouse. And I still have no idea how this happened to this day, but a tour bus rolls up, a big group of people come into the restaurant, and lo and behold, it was Aretha Franklin. So she's getting her, she's getting her meal. I think it was lunch at the time. It was really quiet. So she's getting lunch, and, you're thinking, oh my gosh, Aretha Franklin's here. And wasn't one of my tables, but I was that guy when she was leaving, who went up, and as a really more of a performer at that time, I just kind of asked her, I'm like, hey, look, I know you can't really give one piece of advice isn't going to change someone's life, but I'm curious, what you would say to an aspiring artist and performer about how to really get the wheels going. And she said, play out, just play everywhere and start small and build it out. Play all of the clubs, play all the shows in your local area. And once you kind of get to be the big fish there, spread it out a little bit more and a little bit more. And, I heard that from her back in it was before 2010. So, pretty far removed from that now. And so much of that still exists. And when you look at the real success stories, that's exactly what they did. They started small and slowly grew their way out. There's no way to speed it up, right? Like, if you build a big house and it's on an unstable foundation, it's going to fall apart when you put weight on it. But if you really build that foundation and you really nurture it and get an understanding of what you're good at and who your work is resonating with, you can build that brick by brick, and it's going to last for a very long time. Yeah. So shout out to Aretha Franklin.
Well, and it's anecdotal, but my trombone player played a couple gigs with her as a fill-in, and he said she was the nicest person ever. She was super sweet to work with, and freaking awesome. But what you're kind of saying there, and I fully agree, is that there isn't some secret formula that is going to work for everybody. I mean, it's so individual, and so starting at that local level, not trying to grow too big too quickly and spend tons of money until you know where to put that money. You know what I mean? Because you've got to be so strategic with it. It's hard to make it in music. It's hard to get anywhere, and so you've got to be really smart with your dollars.
Yeah, look, there's more places than ever to be discovered now, which is very exciting. Yeah. But it can also be a bit disorienting, at the start, wondering, oh, where do I just put all of my stuff in the widest traffic? And I think that's where it's like, no, like, don't worry about where the traffic is, worry about where the reaction is. And that will dictate what turns you take.
Yeah. Well, I've definitely kept you longer than I meant to, but I could talk music all day. I love this stuff. And,
we didn't even talk about the big band yet. There's so much more to talk about. When's part 2 coming out? When are we going to set this up?
So I told the wife my rule is, I I'm not going to say the number, but there's a number that gets me out of the house, and if I don't get that, that's her and my agreement about music. Is that if I get X amount, then I will leave the house and I'll go play with the big band. But other than that, I have to stay in my studio and consult and do everything on Zoom. But I do love that part, and I'm sure you miss the performing. Do you still perform at all?
No, you know what? And I'm saying this really more just to kind of reiterate to myself that I need to play more, right? Music is a life sport. There will become a point where your knees get a little too bad for tennis. There will be a point where your lungs feel a little bit small to be playing soccer. But being able to pick up the horn, being able to pick up the guitar, you can always do it. And the only time, I think I talk myself out of it a lot of times, right? We're always busy with work or something. But now this has also been a little bit revitalized with me now that I have a son who is kind of getting to an age where, I want him to know what these sounds are. And we listen to plenty of music, but there are a lot of times where I think, you know what? I should play him something. It's not going to sound as good as the stuff he's listening to, but it's something, and it's all about just kind of getting up and being ready for it. So the more you play, the better you're going to get.
Well, and that's funny how that like one of the happiest days of my life was when I realized my daughter is super into music. Like
That's
as
awesome.
they're developing, and you're like, oh man, she really digs this stuff. You know,
That's great.
and that kind of does revitalize you and make yeah, it and it the every time I book a gig, I regret it. When I book it, I'm like, I shouldn't have done that. I'm so busy. And then every time after the gig, I'm like, thank God I did that. That was so much fun.
There's something to creativity kind of getting us out of languishing. So there's this organizational psychologist. He's also a professor at Wharton School of Business. His name is Adam Grant. And he talks about just that creative output is really aligned with well-being and even productivity at work. He did a study, and I'm going to botch the numbers, but the essence of it was the folks who had some creative outlet outside of work actually ended up being more productive than the folks who didn't have that, because it gave them an outlet to be creative. And a lot of times when we do that, it's really stretching the brain muscle and getting us more open to being able to pick up on patterns and come up with ideas. The people who are constantly brainstorming are just in better shape with that muscle, right? If you're thinking in a creative way outside of, maybe your mundane job, maybe the job you love, just kind of teasing your brain in another way can sometimes promote a little bit of a fire to become more creative and offer some fresh perspective.
Yeah, and so a creative writing professor I had in college said something to me that stuck with me the whole time, and I pass this along to on-air talent when I'm working with them all the time, morning shows and stuff. Just changing up one little thing about your routine, like driving to work a different way, or just one
Mm-hmm.
small little thing will spur creativity. And I don't know why it works, but it freaking works every single
Yeah,
time. You know what I mean? If you're in,
because it gets you out of autopilot.
yep,
Right? Take a 10-minute walk, but instead of just looking down at your feet in front of you, look at the bird, look at the house across the street that, you find yourself never looking at, and sometimes, you'll find inspiration in all that stuff.
yep. So, bringing it back to radio real quickly before I let you go, is there one thing, and you kind of probably already answered this a little bit, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate, but is there kind of one thing that you've been watching this data for years now that has kind of stood out to you looking at this data on pop?
Um, yeah, I think one takeaway is that streaming has been such an undervalued metric when it comes to radio.
Yeah.
As years have gone on, people have been open to embracing it more. But I think that's kind of my cautionary, if you ever think that you're not considering streaming enough, you're probably right. There's something to that.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way to put it. And I think you're right. I heard so much resistance when I even bring up streaming a couple years ago, and now they're everyone's at least open to having that conversation and getting the thoughts on why it's important to look at it. So I think you've created a heck of a product, and I hope people use it. I mean, we've already seen some benefit from looking at it, and we're going to continue to look at it. And I appreciate you doing this and taking the time to sit down. Can you tell them one more time where to get all your stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. You can check out my website, www.longboardinsights.com. And if you click onto the website, up in the top left corner, there's 3 little lines. You click that, and then you'll see a little thing for the power indicator score, and everything you need is right there. And also, I've got a phone, I've got email. If anyone wants it, I've always got it. Longboardinsights@gmail.com is a great way to find me. If you want to be really cool about it, you can go to Mike@longboardinsights.com. That'll work too.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andy. This was super fun.
Radio Influencers is a radio update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.